Yo, welcome to the Punishing Professor Presents Ground Game Soul. I'm the Punishing Professor, and this episode is entitled Why the Grateful Dead is Gangster, and You Ain't Listening Right. For this episode, we're going to talk about one of my favorite Grateful Dead songs, Stagger Lee. Stagger Lee isn't a song that was only written by Robert Hunter and performed by the Grateful Dead, but the song Stagger Lee has been written in many different modalities in Americana and American music. It's one of the reasons why I really enjoy the song. Another reason why I like Stagger Lee, because I'm a professional historian and a Deadhead. The song, as performed by the Grateful Dead, has very loose ties to the history from where it came from. It's changed throughout time, and that's what Robert Hunter did. He fell in the tradition of Americana, the tradition of American and African American folklore, and modified the song not only for the time, but also for the context. So what is the history of the song Stagger Lee? Well, let's talk about the story. The story involves, like the Robert Hunter song, involves a man by the name of Lee Stack Shelton. Stack Lee was his nickname, but Lee Shelton is his name, and Billy Lyons. However, unlike the Robert Hunter version, in which it is a love story in which a bad man who Lee Shelton represents is killed by Billy Lyons' girlfriend after Stag Lee shoots Billy Lyons over a hat, that's not how the story really occurred in history. There's a little bit of a love story to it in that Billy Lyons left children, but Stack Lee does not meet his maker because of the incident that occurred with Billy Lyons. So who is this cat, Stack Lee Shelton? Well, the story begins in 1895 in St. Louis. It happens on a Christmas night. It happens at a social club called the 400 Club. What is this place? Well, in St. Louis in 1895, there's this excellent crossroads that is happening. It is the era of the steamship and travel up and down the Mississippi River. It is the nadir of the lowest points in race relations. African Americans find freedom. The Civil War ended, brought them freedom, but there's the rise of racial violence, Jim Crow, segregation, disenfranchisement, and blacks find themselves with opportunity, but also they have to combat racism. On the steamships, there's a class of African Americans that starts to form. Many of these people play early forms of blues music or recite early forms of blues music. Also, St. Louis becomes the hotbed of a very new form of music in the late 1890s, early 20th century called ragtime. That is rooted in the blues tradition, call and response, antiphony that comes from black culture and African American culture and African culture. But as well, blues music is rooted in the folklore tradition of passing down stories. Not only did it help on the plantations, the development of blues music, rhythm and blues, call and response in working. This was also used on the steamships as well. You had stevedores, people loading and unloading the ships. You had a man that would call out a chant or recite a chant, oftentimes making it up on the spot. And this is where the genesis of R&B, rhythm and blues, blues music, jazz, this intersection between black culture, St. Louis, the Mississippi River, racial violence, and this is where Stack Lee Shelton finds himself. Stack Lee Shelton, like Robert Hunter's story, is without a doubt a bad man. He's the bad man of what is called the Third Ward of St. Louis. It's a rough section of town where they have social clubs. 400 Club happened to be one of these. It is a social club that sells alcohol, but it also works as a social club to promote uplifting the black community. It's also a political social club where African Americans can join and become members of a political party. Now, it's important to understand these social clubs are also places where there is a seedy side of life. This is where Stack Lee Shelton finds himself. Stack Shelton is a pimp He's a Mac. The term Mac, like Mac Dre, Mac Mall, or the 1970s blaxploitation film The Mac, that's rooted in this term that Stagger Lee Shelton was. A well-dressed pimp with a blazing Stetson hat. That's also what Robert Hunter gets correct. The story is rooted in this hat. But the shooting of Billy Lyons does not occur because of a gambling debt or because of a game of dice. It occurs because of the hat, but it occurs because of a political dispute. The bad man, Stagger Lee Shelton, he goes into this club on December 25th, 1895. He gets in an argument with Billy Lyons. Billy Lyons snatches the hat, the white Stetson hat, off of Stagger Lee's head. Stagger Lee tells him, "You better give me that hat." Billy Lyons refuses to give him the hat, and Stagger Lee Shelton shoots Billy Lyons. He shoots him dead. Snatches the hat out of Billy Lyons' hands. So like Robert Hunter's lyrics, the bad man Stagger Lee Shelton shoots Billy Lyons because of that white Stetson hat. Well, the story where Delilah comes back to the bar in Robert Hunter's version and shoots Stagger Lee and takes him back to court where he finds justice is not how the history of this story ends. Mr. Stagger Lee Shelton is arrested. He's put on trial for the murder of Billy Lyons, as I said, who was a father of 2 children. In 1896, the bad man Stagger Lee Shelton is sentenced to 25 years in prison. He actually gets out in less than 5, commits another crime, finds himself back in jail, and dies of syphilis in 1912. So, why did this bad man, this pimp, this person that killed another black man, how does he go on to live not only in folklore and stories, but also to be passed down in a blues tradition throughout the black community and end up in a Grateful Dead song? Well, some of it has to do with really common things in history of America. Some of those common things are outlaw culture. Although America might be a society that believes in law and order, America does have a tradition of uplifting and in some instances, revering the outlaw. There's another tradition in America. That is tradition of folklore and blues music and the advent of rock and roll. And the story of Stagger Lee that starts out as a folk tale rooted in history is able to be passed down in part because of the steamships that allow for the travel of this story up and down the Mississippi. And then the workers who not only work on the docks, on the ships, but the workers that also do the drudgery of working in the levees, right? These people that keep the levees built along the Mississippi. This is some of the most grueling work, infested with mosquitoes and snakes. And the men that drive these, primarily African-American men, some criminals, right? The men that drive these are typically white and brutal. Corporal punishment is used to keep order in these very deadly camps along the Mississippi that keep the river from overflowing. Then hobos hear these stories and they trek out across America. And that folklore tradition that lives throughout Appalachia, north, south, east, and west, helps to transmute and transmit that story of Stagger Lee Shelton throughout America. Another important reason why the story of Stagger Lee was able to leave St. Louis is because of an important musical tradition that began in St. Louis called ragtime. Ragtime was the precursor to jazz, rooted in the rhythm and blues tradition. Ragtime became famous because of a man by the name of Scott Joplin and his maple leaf rag. And ragtime was oftentimes performed in these social clubs. This is where it came from. And that's where Stagger Lee Shelton and Billy Lyons find themselves. right in the root of this musical tradition that is rooted in call and response, rhythm and blues, black folklore, and the story of Stagger Lee shooting Billy Lyons, a black on black crime, is passed down. It's passed down not only in this music tradition of ragtime, it's passed down in hobo camps, it's passed down during the Great Depression as people are migrating west and south, it's passed down along the rails. It is also passed down in the new music that comes after ragtime, blues. And the blues tradition is where some of the first recordings of this story, Stagger Lee, come. But like the folklore oral tradition, the story, the history of Stagger Lee is changed, transmuted to represent the culture, ideas, and messages of the time. By the 1920s, the story of Stagger Lee Shelton had made its way into what were called blues race records. Ma Rainey, Mississippi John Hurt, probably some of the most famous African Americans to produce this song in the blues version in the 1920s. However, it's important to recognize that this Stagger Lee was the Stagger Lee that was a bad man. And the messages that happened and occurred in the 1920s really reflect the conditions that African Americans faced during that era. A message that I think is important to understand about the context of the 1920s is this is an era where African Americans were lynched throughout America with impunity. And although Stagger Lee Shelton was a bad man, he wasn't a villain. He was the embodiment of black resistance against this violent system of Jim Crow. So to African Americans, they didn't look at Stagger Lee as a bad outlaw, as a villain, someone to be despised. Instead, the character of Stagger Lee, comes to represent resistance against a system that African Americans understand is oppressive. So after the 1920s, the legend of Stagger Lee didn't die. It just transformed as it had in previous generations. Lloyd Price did a song in the 1950s making Stagger Lee less violent. Also in the 1960s and 70s, Taj Mahal and Bob Dylan used that same form of Stagger Lee, promoting Americana and rebellion. One of the most radical transformations of the story of Stagger Lee, and also of the icon of Stagger Lee Shelton as the Mac pimp, well-dressed man with the white Stetson hat, occurs in the late 70s and 1980s. Blaxploitation, the movie The Mac, but also in music in the rising genre of hip-hop. And in particular, one aspect that ties us back to the beginning of this episode, Why the Grateful Dead is Gangster and You Ain't Listening Right, the rise of gangster rap. So in the 1970s and 80s, this new genre of music called rap and culture of hip-hop starts to make it mainstream. And in 1986, one particular genre called gangster rap starts to find it into the mainstream as well through Ice-T and his story 6 in the Morning. This really is the evolution of the story of Stagger Lee Shelton in the 1980s. Why? Well, Ice-T's persona in this song is sharp, strategic, cold when needed. He's a thinker, a survivor. Like Stagger Lee, gangster rap might promote violence, but gangster rap is about the anti-hero. Stagger Lee is the anti-hero. He's the cat that resists the structure and the system that is against him. He's the cat that looks at the overall structures and sees it as a game and understands that it's a game that people play at different levels. Like the G's in South Central, in Oakland, right? Like those cats that lived against the system in the counterculture of the 1960s, G's have a code similar to the Outlaw code. Yes, one of these codes that unifies them is no snitches. And yes, these codes are oftentimes violated not only by G's, but also in cultures and subcultures like the Grateful Dead. But some of the things that unify them are these commonalities, these things that the outlaw isn't somebody to be feared, isn't a villain, but that the outlaw can be used and upheld as a symbol of resistance against a corrupt system. And this is where gangster rap, as promoted in the 1980s and 1990s, that's how it aligns with this character and story of Stagger Lee Shelton. Stagger Lee Shelton and Stagger Lee is about resistance. That's the history of it. That's how African Americans viewed it, saw it, and passed it down. But Stagger Lee Shelton was transmuted by black people, and it became folklore. And that way, that story became everybody's. It becomes the tradition of Americana. It becomes rooted in American culture and American history and American tradition. And that's why I dig the Grateful Dead. The Grateful Dead is not just a rock and roll band. It's a rock and roll band that's rooted in Americana. It's a rock and roll band that understands the history of this nation, taps into the traditions of folklore, of various cultures and music traditions, interprets it on their own, and brings it to the world. So how is the Grateful Dead Gangster, and how are you not listening to it right? Well, this is just my own view and interpretation. There are many different levels to life. I am a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but there are black belts that would smoke me in seconds on the mat. There are levels to life. Just like in Grateful Dead land, Deadheads, that world has various levels. It is a world where there are people that get engaged in making a lot of money doing things illegally. It is a world about freedom. And sometimes that freedom goes against laws that are out there. And this is how it ties, oftentimes, that I view into this idea of the gangster code. That people on Grateful Dead tour, or even people that just show up to shows and listen to the music, understand that not only are they engaging in a collective activity that ultimately, at least to me, is about promoting love, but they're also going to engage in a collective activity that oftentimes involves illegal acts, particularly as it relates to drug use and the way that people make their money. And on Grateful Dead tour, which I did for about 2.5 years of my life, it allowed me to go to 150 Grateful Dead shows with Jerry Garcia, see over 20 Grateful Jerry Garcia band shows. There were levels to that as well. I was not at any high level. I was just a cat from Princeton, New Jersey that jumped on and found a crew of friends and people and family that I love that are still influential in my life. And oftentimes we engage in things that involve illicit activities, right? People selling drugs. But there were other cats on Grateful Dead tour that didn't. They sold t-shirts. They sold dresses. They sold pipes, right? They sold their own artwork, right? But it was a collective community that people were engaged in. And one of the ways that this relates, again, back to the gangster code was on the level that I was in, right? And the level that I was in was like these cats that like to make money any way that we potentially could, right? Sometimes it might have been selling veggie burritos. Sometimes it might have been selling dime bags of weed and 20 sacks of weed on Telegraph Avenue and Haight Street. And as a young dude from Princeton, New Jersey, right, in 1990, being on Telegraph Avenue on Friday and Saturday nights, the 1st and the 15th, that had been exposed to Ice-T and gangster rap, this is where it all really started clicking and making sense to me. I got to see the 1st and the 15th. Cats coming down from East Oakland to find the hippies that would hook them up with the drugs that they were looking for. I got to see, hey, cats make a lot of money this night. Go and get a nice hotel. Go and get an eighth of weed. Maybe a dime sack, right? Maybe buy a new pair of shoes. Feeling like a G, right? Feeling like you're on top of the world. And that's what part of Grateful Dead land and Grateful Dead world were to me, and maybe even to some of my crews. But for me, I will tell you, I felt like a G most in Grateful Dead land at the end of the day when I had a ticket in my hand, 20 sack of weed, a little bit of money, and a hotel room. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this story about Stagger Lee, understanding the history, how the Grateful Dead tapped in some of this history, Americana, African American history, black culture, folklore, but also the G code.